I'm done with you. That child isn't mine." Damon's words slammed into Ilara like a punch, divorce papers thrown onto her birthday table. Heartbroken, alone and pregnant, she stumbled into the pouring rain until a sleek black Bentley screeched to a stop. Hale Mercer stepped out, tall, commanding, eyes sharp as knives. "Get in! You're not staying out here." In that instant, everything changed. Her life, her choices, her future. "Welcome back to Beyond Color Stories. We're so glad you're here. Tell us, where are you listening from today? Make sure you don't skip a single moment, because this story, from start to finish, will touch your soul. And before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories. All right, let's dive in. Rain lashed against the cobblestones, splattering in chaotic patterns that mirrored the turmoil twisting in Ilara's chest. Her small bag, packed hastily, clung wetly to her side as she pressed a trembling hand against the curve of her abdomen, feeling the life within her move and writhe as though aware of the storm outside and the storm inside her own life. She had walked out of her house moments ago, leaving behind the sound of the door slamming with a finality that still rang in her ears, the echo carving itself into her memory. Damon had thrown her out as if she were nothing, as if years of marriage were meaningless, as if a single whispered lie from Sienna, a lie designed to poison, to fracture, to destroy, was enough to convince him that she didn't deserve the life they had built. And on her birthday, no less, the day that should have been hers, he handed her divorce papers like a cruel gift wrapped in indifference. Ilara's stomach churned with disbelief, with anger, with an ache that was both physical and emotional, but she did not shout. She did not plead. She did not cry out. She had learned long ago that tears and words could be used against her, that pleading made her weaker in the eyes of men who never deserved her, and tonight she would not give Damon the satisfaction of watching her break. She stepped away from the doorway, each footfall on the slick pavement echoing like the beat of a heart that was learning to survive on its own. The rain soaked through the thin fabric of her coat, cold crawling beneath it like 1,000 tiny fingers, and yet, even as her legs threatened to buckle under exhaustion and the chill, she refused to stop. She refused to look back. Her mind raced, fragmented thoughts colliding violently. How could Damon believe Sienna so easily? How could the man who once whispered promises of love in her ear now strip her of everything she had, home, dignity, security, and a sense of belonging, in a single motion? Her pulse hammered in her temples as the rain blurred her vision, mixing the falling water with the tears she refused to release. Each breath she drew was shallow, cautious, measured, as if taking too much air might allow the storm in her chest to escape in a scream she couldn't contain. She stumbled slightly, wet shoes slipping on the cobblestones, and her bag shifted, the strap cutting into her shoulder, reminding her of the weight of reality she carried, a life inside her, growing with no protection, and a world that seemed determined to crush her before she could even stand. And then, as though the universe had decided to test her further, a pair of headlights pierced the darkness, the brilliance cutting through the sheets of rain and momentarily blinding her, forcing her to shield her eyes with her hand. She froze, instinctively unsure whether to run or wait, whether to scream or cower, because at that hour, in that storm, anyone could be dangerous. The sleek black Bentley rolled to a stop a few feet away, its engine cutting through the rain like a knife through fabric. The doors opened and a man stepped out, and the world seemed to slow, each raindrop suspended in mid-air as she took in his presence. He was tall, impossibly composed, with a jaw that could have been carved from marble, and eyes so sharp they seemed to pierce through the layers of chaos surrounding her. There was no hesitation in his movement, no glance of uncertainty, only the cold precision of someone who had seen too much and anticipated everything. Hale Mercer. The name she didn't know yet, but instinctively recognized as power, as threat, as salvation. His gaze lingered on her for a fraction of a second longer than normal, calculating, assessing, and then he spoke, low, steady, commanding, "You shouldn't be out here." The words were simple, devoid of warmth, yet layered with authority. Ilara wanted to walk away, to shake her head, and insist she could manage, but her body betrayed her. The rain had soaked through every layer of clothing, the wind cut into her lungs, and the small wave of nausea from her pregnancy made her knees wobble. Before she could collapse, Hale was there, catching her with a grip firm enough to hold her upright but gentle enough not to hurt her. "I'm taking you somewhere safe," he said. She hesitated, the instinct to mistrust screaming louder than any other thought. Who was he? Why was he stopping for her in the middle of a stormy night? And yet, survival whispered its sharp truth in her ear. She had nowhere else to go, no one else who cared whether she lived or froze to death tonight. Pride, for once, was a luxury she could not afford. She stepped closer to him, then into the car, and the door closed with a heavy click that sounded like the sealing of a fragile promise. Inside the Bentley, the warmth was immediate, but not comforting. The leather seats were sleek, unyielding, and Hale sat across from her, hands clasped loosely, observing her as if she were a puzzle piece, in a game she didn't yet understand. He didn't speak for a few moments, letting her adjust, letting her realize that no one had come for her out of kindness in a long time. When he finally spoke, it was precise, almost surgical in delivery. "Where do you want to go?" His voice carried no softness, no charity, no expectation of gratitude. Ilara opened her mouth to answer, but realized she had no words that could adequately explain where one goes when the world had abandoned you. Hale didn't wait for a reply. He had already made the decision for her, dialing a number with deliberate efficiency. "Activate the file on Damon Voss. I want everything before midnight," he ordered, his tone carrying both authority and urgency, a signal that her life was about to become more entwined with his plans than she could have imagined. The Bentley rolled on through the storm, its tires hissing against the wet asphalt, carrying her away from the ruins of her old life, the city lights reflecting in the rain-slicked windows and revealing glimpses of her reflection, pale, wet, trembling, but still alive. Every street they passed was a reminder of how fragile her existence had become, how quickly stability could vanish, and how one lie could undo years of love and trust. She tried to focus on the mundane, street signs, passing cars, the hum of the engine, but her mind replayed Damon's last words, Sienna's smile, and the cruel efficiency with which her world had been dismantled. Hale glanced at her once, as if reading thoughts she had never voiced aloud, and for a moment she saw the faintest flicker of calculation behind his eyes, a recognition that this situation was not random and that someone powerful had already been watching, analyzing, preparing for exactly this moment. A shiver ran down her spine, not from the cold, but from the unnerving certainty that her life was about to change forever, though she had no idea whether that change would save her or break her further. The rain began to lighten, turning into a mist that clung to the glass of the car, yet the storm inside Ilara remained. Questions collided with fear. Who was Hale Mercer? Why had he stopped? How much did he know? And most importantly, could she trust him at all when every person she had relied on had betrayed her? As the Bentley turned into a side street, headlights reflecting off puddles like fractured mirrors, she realized she was holding her breath, not just from fear, but from the anticipation of what came next. And just when she thought the night could not become any stranger, Hale's low voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "We're almost there. Once we arrive, nothing from tonight touches you again, unless you let it." Ilara's heart skipped, a tremor of hope mixing with dread. The car slowed, pulling up to a building that gleamed against the wet night, towering above the city, lights shimmering off the wet stone as though it had been waiting for her arrival, and she realized, with both awe and apprehension, that the night had only begun. Somewhere behind her, Damon's world still raged, still hunted, still threatened, but here, in this moment, she was not at his mercy. She was being observed, analyzed, protected, and in a way that terrified her as much as it intrigued her. She had escaped the storm outside, but the storm inside her was far from over. And as the Bentley door opened, the wind carrying the scent of rain and electricity, she stepped out into a world she did not yet understand, unaware that the very man who had pulled her from the edge had already set wheels in motion that would change everything. And in that heartbeat of silence, the night held its first secret, waiting to unravel. Hale's gaze swept the penthouse as he entered, his fingers brushing over the folder he had brought with him, and he murmured to himself, "She belongs here. For now. But if Damon moves, I'll know before he even thinks." Ilara blinked against the soft morning light spilling through floor-to-ceiling windows, the world outside reduced to miniature streets and cars glinting like scattered jewels across the city below. And for a moment she could not process where she was, the sharp contrast between the storm-soaked night and this serene sanctuary leaving her senses numb. The penthouse itself was impossibly vast, all polished marble floors and high ceilings, walls lined with abstract art that felt deliberate, precise, expensive, and yet somehow cold, as if it existed less to comfort and more to observe. Hale Mercer stood near the window, arms crossed, jaw set, gaze fixed on her with a scrutiny that was almost scientific, and in that quiet, his presence was intimidating yet strangely commanding. He didn't flinch, didn't soften his posture when she stirred, didn't even offer the hollow politeness of a caretaker. He waited, silent but unyielding, as if her waking had been an event in his careful plan rather than an accident of circumstance. When her eyes finally focused, taking in his figure, his intensity hit her. There was nothing performative in his watchfulness, no curiosity or casual concern, only a calculated evaluation, precise and unrelenting, as if he had already categorized her thoughts, her fears, her weaknesses, and her defenses, all before she had the chance to fully rise from the sheets. "Who put you in the street?" he asked finally, his voice low, even, and measured, but laced with the expectation of honesty. His gaze did not soften, did not plead, did not wait patiently. It demanded truth. Ilara's lips parted to dodge the question, to offer a vague murmur, but the words stuck in her throat because she knew instinctively that in his presence half-truths would only unravel faster than lies. Hale's eyes narrowed, and the slightest dip of his brow was enough to make her falter. "Don't insult my intelligence," he said, flat and final, cutting through her hesitation like a blade. Every instinct in her screamed to retreat, to curl inward, to protect herself, but the gentle weight of exhaustion forced her to speak, to confess the humiliation that had driven her into the rain. She told him everything. Damon's sudden cruelty, the poisoned lie Sienna had whispered about her unborn child, the birthday betrayal when the divorce papers were thrust into her hands like a declaration of worthlessness, the years of subtle emotional manipulation that had left her flinching at raised voices, apologizing when she shouldn't have, shrinking into corners to survive rather than living. Words that had never been voiced before poured out, some trembling, some jagged, some whispered like prayers, and for each revelation, Hale said nothing, his expression unreadable, a mask of control that unnerved her almost as much as the thought of Damon's betrayal. But within that silence there was a tension, razor-sharp, uncompromising. Every gesture, every syllable she uttered, every pause between words was observed, analyzed, stored. There was no pity in his eyes, no sudden softening, no misplaced sympathy, only clarity, focus, and a methodical understanding that made her chest tighten with the realization that he was seeing her, truly seeing her, in a way that no one ever had. Finally, after hours or maybe minutes, time blurred in the haze of exhaustion and shock, he spoke. "You can stay for 48 hours, he said. the words measured, deliberate. 48 hours to stabilize. After that, you decide your next step. There was no offer of charity, no plea to express gratitude, no feigned warmth. He was not saving her out of kindness. He was saving her because, in his mind, the situation demanded structure, and structure, he believed, was more powerful than comfort. The sharp precision of the statement struck her as strange but grounding. It was almost cruel in its honesty, yet it carried a weight of safety she had not felt in years. When she cautiously rose from the guest room bed, still shaking, still damp from the residual chill in her bones, she noticed something subtle that unsettled her further. Hale had left the door slightly ajar, not wide open, not in invitation, but ajar, like a line drawn between protection and observation. It struck her as deliberate. He did not need to assure her. The slight crack of the door said it all. He was aware she might feel trapped, but he also expected her to notice that she was not alone, that someone was watching, analyzing, prepared to intervene if needed. It was at once comforting and unnerving. Ilara padded softly across the polished floors toward the kitchen area, still barefoot, still wet, drawn by the faint hum of the coffee machine and the city murmuring beneath the penthouse. Her eyes caught him across the room at his desk, bent over a folder that radiated authority and intent. Papers, spreadsheets, photographs, documents, messages, everything was there, meticulously arranged. Her stomach lurched as she realized what she was looking at. Damon's finances, his messages, his hidden accounts, the threads of deceit she had never noticed, laid bare before someone who clearly had anticipated her arrival. Her lips parted slightly, and her hand rose unconsciously to her chest, as if she could shield herself from the truth of what this man knew. He hadn't gathered this information after the fact. He had been preparing for her, strategizing, as though he had seen the storm coming and positioned himself precisely where he needed to be. The hum of the city outside contrasted sharply with the tension inside. Every sound, the faint whistle of wind past the windows, the soft click of the folder on his desk, the distant honk of a car below, was amplified. Each one a reminder that nothing was random in this penthouse, that every element, every gesture, every calculated pause was deliberate. Ilara felt her pulse spike, a mixture of awe, fear, and the faintest twinge of trust beginning to take root despite herself. She was a stranger in this man's world, yet somehow she was under his shield, though she had no idea how temporary or permanent it might be. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. As she poured herself a glass of water, her reflection caught in the sleek countertop. A pale, wet, trembling woman who had been stripped of her home, her dignity and her sense of belonging. She realized that Hale's presence was the first anchor she had in months, yet the circumstances were dangerous. She did not know why he had stopped, why he had acted, why he had invested himself in her fate when he could have ignored it entirely. The question echoed in her mind. Who exactly was this man who anticipated everything, who moved with precision, who watched and evaluated as though he had already foreseen the next betrayal, the next threat? And then the faint vibration of a phone broke the silence, and Hale's eyes flicked toward the screen, cold calculation sweeping across his face. He did not answer it immediately, and Ilara, frozen mid-step, realized she had been watched the entire time, observed not for kindness, not for charity, but for control. The thought made her shiver, even as the tiny ember of safety glimmered within her chest. Something else was at play, a plan, a preparation, a reason for his actions she could not yet understand. Hale finally picked up the phone, his voice low, deliberate and cold. "Yes, I want everything on Damon Voss before midnight, no exceptions." Ilara froze, the weight of those words sinking in. Someone was watching, calculating, and Damon had no idea what was coming for him. The game had just begun, and she was caught at the center of it, unprepared but entirely dependent on a man whose mind was sharper than any storm she had survived. 3. The moment Ilara closed the door behind her, leaving the faint echo of the penthouse behind, Hale's presence lingered like gravity, pulling at her awareness even in the shadows of her own room. She sank onto the edge of the bed, drenched not from the rain anymore, but from a fatigue that had nothing to do with sleep, a weariness that seeped into her bones and refused to loosen its grip. Every muscle in her body ached, every nerve throbbed with the kind of tension that comes from months of walking on eggshells, and yet the space she now occupied carried a strange duality. It was unfamiliar, sterile in its perfection, intimidating in its precision, but it also offered a fragile sense of safety she had not realized she had been starving for. And as she rested for a brief moment, just long enough to acknowledge that she was alive, that her child was moving quietly beneath her hand, the thought struck her with both awe and unease. She had not yet asked herself why Hale had intervened. He was not soft. He had not been gentle. He had offered her survival without expectation of gratitude, provided structure without the comfort of emotional reassurance. She did not know what kind of man this was, but she sensed that every action, every choice, every decision was deliberate, measured, and designed to achieve a purpose she could not yet comprehend. When she finally made her way to the dining area, the soft hum of the city below felt distant, filtered through the immense glass walls that separated her from the chaos outside. Hale had set the table for one, his own place empty across from hers, as though he were both present and absent at once. There was no pretense of small talk, no idle curiosity about her night, no polite concern for her comfort. The meal was immaculate, arranged with the kind of exacting precision that demanded observation as much as consumption. Ilara picked at the edges of her plate, feeling the tension coil tighter with every glance she risked in his direction. Hale was watching, not in a superficial way, not in a flirtatious or intrusive manner, but with the slow, unblinking scrutiny of someone who had dissected countless lives and behaviors and had learned to spot patterns invisible to the ordinary eye. He noticed everything. How she flinched at the sound of a knife clinking against porcelain, how she checked the clock every few minutes as if measuring the span of time she was permitted to breathe safely, how she avoided eye contact until she thought no one could see her trembling. He did not intervene in her nervous habits, but he catalogued them, filing each gesture in a mental ledger that mapped the contours of her fear, her caution, her instinct to make herself smaller than she was. When he spoke, it was not a question, not a lecture, not even a comment meant to comfort. It was a statement, blunt and precise, a truth delivered without sugarcoating. Damon didn't just mistreat you, he rewired you. The words landed with the sharpness of a scalpel, cutting through layers of denial, self-protection, and exhaustion. Ilara's fork trembled in her hand, and she felt the sting of tears behind her eyelids, not from weakness, but from recognition. He was not pitying her. He was not assessing her like a fragile object. He was stating fact, and the clarity of it, brutal as it was, unlocked something in her that she had long forgotten. Acknowledgement of what had been done to her, the silent violence of being reshaped, not through force alone, but through subtle manipulation, control, and the relentless erasure of her confidence. Hale's voice carried no emotion, but his words resonated, and for the first time in months she found herself sitting straighter, aligning her posture not just in the chair, but with a small measure of internal resolve that had been dormant far too long. Yet the fragile steadiness was immediately tested. A clatter, her fork slipped and bounced against the plate, made her recoil sharply. The suddenness of the sound, magnified by her heightened nerves, sent a shiver up her spine and a wave of panic she could not suppress. Hale's jaw tightened subtly, imperceptibly to anyone but her, registering the precise source of her reaction. Not the noise itself, but the pattern behind it. the trauma accumulated over years of conditioned fear. Her flinch, her retreat, the way she froze in anticipation of reprimand or punishment, it all spoke to damage inflicted gradually, invisibly, yet more enduring than any single moment of violence could ever achieve. The revelation settled in his mind like a calculation, a mental note that required attention. She had been trained to shrink, to avoid, to apologize preemptively, and that behavior would require more than comfort to undo. It would demand strategy, patience, and the subtle insistence of presence that she could not ignore. After the meal, Hale excused himself silently, moving with the kind of efficiency that made every gesture seem consequential. He entered his office without looking back, leaving the door slightly ajar, as if signaling that he would return, but only when he was ready, only when she had adjusted enough to accept the reality of her new environment. The soft click of the door closing behind him was accompanied by the faint rustle of papers, the low hum of electronics, and then the sound of his voice, measured, icy, carrying the authority of someone who was not used to tolerating incompetence or deceit. "Keep digging. No man throws out his wife this abruptly unless he's hiding something bigger." His words were directed into the phone, each syllable deliberate, each phrase weighted with intention. There was no warmth, no suggestion of casual curiosity. This was command, order, strategy. Someone had to act, to uncover the truth, to ensure that the chaos Damon had created would not extend beyond the bounds Hale deemed acceptable. Ilara, unaware of the conversation but acutely aware of the quiet, felt the penthouse shift around her, a subtle current of control and observation that pressed against her awareness. Every glance, every movement, every slight adjustment of the environment seemed designed to teach her, to condition her, to draw her out of the fear-based reflexes Damon had instilled and into something more deliberate, more conscious. The apartment was not merely a place of shelter. It was a controlled environment, a testing ground, a space where she could exist, survive, and perhaps, in time, reclaim fragments of herself she had lost. The realization both frightened and intrigued her, for she had never experienced safety delivered without sentiment, structure imposed without obligation, and yet, paradoxically, she could not deny that the clarity of the arrangement offered a new kind of security, one she had not allowed herself to imagine until this night. As she moved toward the large windows to take in the city below, her reflection caught her attention. A figure still frail in posture, weary from trauma, yet present, visible, existing in a space that had been earned rather than granted. And for the first time, she acknowledged the possibility that someone's intervention could carry purpose beyond simple altruism. Hale's methodical approach, the evidence of his preparation, and the aura of inevitability he projected made it clear. This was not chance. Nothing about him, nothing about the timing of her rescue, nothing about the meticulous precision of the documents she had glimpsed earlier was accidental. A faint chime from his desk alerted her to movement beyond the open door, and before she could react, Hale's low, deliberate words drifted into the room, carried as if meant only for her to hear. "She's more important than she realizes, and if Damon thinks he's in control, he's already lost." Ilara froze, heart hammering, knowing instinctively that the storm outside had been only the beginning, and the real turbulence was just starting to unfold. Hale Mercer had never been captivated by beauty alone. The world he inhabited had offered him a gallery of women whose faces could launch 1,000 desires, whose curves could provoke longing, whose elegance was meticulously crafted to manipulate, to charm, to seduce. He had seen them all, engaged with them all in fleeting encounters, some professional, some indulgent, some carefully orchestrated for appearances. Each had left him unchanged, unmoved, as though their allure existed on a shallow surface that never touched the substance beneath. He had long ago learned to distinguish between what was decorative and what was real, between the frivolity of charm and the solidity of character. And then there was Ilara. She did not possess the kind of dazzling, polished beauty that demanded attention. She did not move with calculated grace, nor drape herself in the aura of entitlement or desire. Yet something about her unsettled him in ways he did not wish to acknowledge, in ways that defied the logic he had spent a lifetime sharpening. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. The housekeeper, a timid woman who moved like a shadow in the penthouse, had dropped a glass while cleaning, the crash startling in the otherwise quiet evening. The sound, minor though it was, caused the woman to freeze, panic spreading across her face as she glanced nervously at Hale, perhaps expecting reprimand. Ilara, despite the exhaustion that weighed on every muscle of her body and the constant ache from her pregnancy, knelt beside the housekeeper, picking up the fragments with care, speaking soft words of reassurance. There was no theatrics in her actions, no desire for recognition, no thought for her own comfort. She simply responded to a need in the moment, a clarity of purpose that struck Hale unexpectedly. He watched from the doorway, arms crossed, jaw set, eyes narrowing, not in disapproval, but in an awareness that this was not the kind of behavior he was accustomed to seeing. The act itself was small, almost trivial, yet it revealed a depth of empathy, a willingness to extend herself despite exhaustion and personal chaos, and Hale felt the first twitch of something unfamiliar stir in his chest, a warmth, unwelcome yet insistent, a recognition that she operated from a place of genuine resilience rather than self-interest. Later, he found himself walking past her room, ostensibly to check the security monitors, ostensibly to review reports or finalize tasks, yet the pull of curiosity, or perhaps something more, drew him near. From the slight crack of the door, he overheard her voice, low and tremulous, whispering into the dim light. Her words meant for no one but the small life growing within her. She promised the child protection, safety, and a future, even if the world abandoned them, even if she had to stand alone. The sincerity, the courage, the quiet determination in her voice struck him profoundly, making the controlled muscles of his chest tighten as he suppressed the stirrings of emotion he had long trained himself to ignore. It was not pity that moved him. It was not obligation or the faintest sense of duty. It was recognition of a rare, almost sacred strength, the kind that could endure pain and loss, yet still respond with care rather than bitterness, with gentleness rather than hardened walls. Hale began to notice the subtle ways she carried herself in his presence, how she did not demand attention, but allowed it to settle on her naturally, how she moved carefully, thoughtfully, weighing her own actions even when the stakes were low, as though the habits of trauma had taught her vigilance, yet her inherent grace could not be hidden entirely. During meals, he found himself lingering longer than necessary at the table, watching her not as an analyst cataloguing behaviors or assessing vulnerabilities, but as someone unconsciously attempting to comprehend the gravity of her character. Each glance became a quiet measurement, each subtle expression a signal he was compelled to read. He told himself it was observation, it was strategy, it was an element of control, but the truth, buried beneath the layers of restraint he had imposed on himself, was far more complex. He was fascinated by her, caught against his own rules and expectations, intrigued by a force of nature clothed in vulnerability. One evening, as they sat in near silence, the city lights casting fractured reflections across the polished surfaces of the penthouse, Hale caught himself staring longer than propriety or even awareness would allow. She noticed nothing, preoccupied with her own thoughts, tracing patterns on the table with her fingertips, lost in moments he could not intrude upon without violating boundaries. His chest tightened at the realization that he had lingered too long, that the pull of her presence was influencing him in ways he had not permitted himself to admit. Muttering under his breath, Barely audible even to himself, he acknowledged the truth he had been denying. This is becoming a problem. The words lingered, cold and deliberate, yet loaded with an unspoken acknowledgement of the storm rising within him, the inexplicable urge to care, to protect, to watch over her beyond what reason or strategy could justify. Against every lesson he had ever learned about restraint, against every rule he had imposed on his heart to avoid entanglement, Hale found himself moving toward her room, toward the source of the quiet strength that had infiltrated his thoughts and unsettled the precision of his mind. He raised a hand to the door, hesitated for a fraction of a second, a pause that carried more than logic, more than calculation, and knocked softly. The sound echoed against the polished surfaces, minimal, unobtrusive, yet deliberate, and Ilara, startled by the sudden intrusion, glanced up from the faint glow of her desk lamp. Their eyes met, hers wide, uncertain, and his steady, calculating yet unguarded, as if the moment itself carried the weight of unspoken understanding. Hale's voice, low and controlled, yet carrying an unfamiliar warmth that surprised even him, broke the silence. "May I come in?" The words were measured, polite, yet heavy with intention, a bridge between the boundaries of professional observation and something far more personal, something that neither of them fully understood, yet both recognized. Ilara's heart thumped in a way that startled her, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and the faint glimmer of trust she had not known she was capable of feeling. Her lips parted to respond, but the words caught in her throat as she noted the subtle shift in his posture, the faint tension in his jaw, the eyes that now reflected not only scrutiny but concern, fascination, and something dangerously close to admiration. She nodded, small and cautious, and Hale entered, closing the gap between observation and presence, his steps deliberate, measured, commanding yet oddly deferential, as if the space he now occupied was simultaneously his domain and a territory he had no right to claim, but could not resist. He did not sit immediately. He remained standing, watching, waiting, the air between them thick with an unspoken understanding that something had changed, that the calculation of control had become entangled with something far less predictable. Emotion, perhaps, or obsession, or the raw acknowledgement of human resilience in its most unvarnished form. As Hale finally stepped closer, lowering his voice almost to a whisper meant only for her ears, he said, "You possess something rare. Don't underestimate what that will do to the world around you, or to me." Ilara froze, uncertainty and curiosity coiling together, realizing for the first time that she was no longer merely a guest under his protection. She had become a presence he could not ignore, and the consequences of that awareness, for both of them, were only beginning to emerge. 5. The morning sunlight seeped through the penthouse windows, illuminating the polished floors and highlighting the faint tremor in Ilara's hands as she fumbled with the straps of her coat. Today was a day she had been dreading, though she had tried to convince herself it was routine. Her doctor's appointment. Months of anticipation, worry, and the constant ache of carrying a life within her body had culminated in this single trip, and she had initially planned to go alone. She wanted to reclaim a fragment of independence, to remind herself that she could still make choices, that she could still step into the world without leaning on anyone. But Hale, as always, was 2 steps ahead. The moment she mentioned her intention, he cut her off with a firmness that brooked no argument. "You're not walking anywhere," he said. The statement clipped, precise, devoid of debate. There was no questioning it, no polite negotiation. In that single, deliberate sentence, he had assumed control of a part of her life she had been desperately trying to protect. And although a flicker of resistance rose within her, it was quickly quashed by the exhaustion that still clung to her like a second skin. She had no energy to argue. She simply nodded, allowing him to accompany her, despite the faint, stubborn ache in her chest at losing even this small piece of autonomy. The drive to the clinic was silent, but heavy with unspoken emotion. Hale's hands gripped the steering wheel with rigid authority, the muscles in his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the road yet frequently flicking toward her with a precision she could not read. He said nothing, not even the typical small talk one might expect from a driver or companion. His silence was deliberate, suffused with a tension that radiated into the car like a living thing. She stole glances at him, noting the lines of concentration, the subtle clench of his fists, the faint twitch of an eyebrow as he observed her from the corner of his vision. There was a dissonance in his presence, a combination of protection and restraint, awareness and distance, that unsettled her, even as it made her pulse quicken. When they entered the examination room, Hale remained stiffly in the chair beside her, arms folded, back rigid, as though the clinical sterility of the environment offended him on some fundamental level. He did not fidget, did not glance at his phone, did not retreat into habitual distraction. He simply remained present, immovable, a sentinel in a world of sterile white walls and the faint hum of medical machinery. His eyes occasionally flicked toward her, registering the tension in her shoulders, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the subtle tremor in her hands that she tried to hide beneath the folds of her coat. He observed without commentary, and yet his mere presence exerted a quiet, pressing influence, a gravitational pull she could neither resist nor fully comprehend. Then the nurse activated the monitor, and the room filled with the rhythmic, almost musical, thumping of the baby's heartbeat. Ilara felt it first in her chest, then in her throat, and finally behind her eyes, where tears gathered unbidden. She tried to blink them away, tried to swallow the emotion that welled so unexpectedly, but it was impossible to deny. The sound was more than a heartbeat. It was proof of life, of survival, of a fragile future she had fought to preserve alone until tonight. Without thinking, she reached for the nearest support, her fingers brushing against Hale's hand. He did not hesitate. His thumb swept over the knuckles of her trembling hand in the slightest, most instinctive gesture of reassurance he could offer, and he did it so subtly that he pretended not to notice afterward, withdrawing his hand as though nothing had passed between them. Yet the simple connection, fleeting though it was, sent warmth curling through her chest, a small flicker of trust amid the storm of fear and uncertainty. The drive back was marked by an almost oppressive silence, but this time it carried a weight of intimacy. Hale did not glance at his phone once, did not reach for it, did not divert his attention elsewhere. He simply sat, observing, noting, his eyes flicking to hers with a mixture of curiosity, assessment, and something indefinable, something that went beyond logic, beyond strategy, and hovered on the precipice of feeling. She caught him watching, occasionally locking eyes with her, a faint tension threading the brief encounters of their gaze. It was subtle but undeniable. Her chest tightened each time, a quiet flutter of something she had not allowed herself to recognize in years, a tension, and perhaps the first hint of admiration. Later that evening, the penthouse felt warmer, softer somehow, as Hale entered with a tray carrying a cup of milk, steam curling gently above the rim. He set it down beside her, standing awkwardly as though the simple act of offering comfort required negotiation with every muscle in his body. "Helps with sleep," he muttered. The words clipped, almost clinical, as if the explanation was sufficient to mask any personal intention. Ilara glanced at him, the faintest smile tugging at her lips, a smile so rare, so honest, that it had not appeared since the night he first brought her here. Hale, ever precise, looked away quickly, jaw tight, eyes shifting toward the city lights streaming through the windows as though he could not bear to confront the impact her happiness had on him. He told himself it was irrelevant, a lapse in focus, a transient distraction, yet the truth gnawed quietly. He did not understand why the simplicity of her smile unsettled him so thoroughly. The fragile domesticity of the moment shattered abruptly when her phone illuminated, casting a pale glow across her lap. Damon's name flashed, a number she had long since attempted to ignore, yet now appeared with clarity, restored no less by Hale's silent intervention. The tension in the room shifted, immediate and electric. Ilara froze, fingers hovering above the screen, her heartbeat quickening, the memory of betrayal and humiliation rising like a wave from the depths of her psyche. She knew, even before she looked at Hale, that the moment demanded a choice, a confrontation she had not wanted, yet could not avoid. Hale, standing rigidly nearby, did not reach to snatch the phone or attempt to shield her from the intrusion. Instead, his voice, calm yet absolute, cut through the tension with the precision of a scalpel. "Answer it." There was no room for debate, no trace of suggestion. The statement carried authority, certainty, and a subtle challenge wrapped in the ice of command. Ilara's fingers trembled as she lifted the phone, her mind racing, and she realized in that instant that she was no longer navigating the world alone. Hale's presence, his insistence, his unwavering support, even in something as simple as answering a phone call, was a tether, fragile yet powerful, anchoring her amid the storm of her life. For a long moment, she hesitated, gazing at the screen, the letters forming a name that had once meant safety and now only signified danger. Hale's eyes met hers, steady, unyielding, a silent signal that he would not allow her to falter, would not permit Damon's shadow to intimidate or manipulate her again. And in that charged silence, Ilara understood something she had not allowed herself to admit. She was no longer the same woman who had been thrown into the rain, abandoned and humiliated. She had an ally, relentless, calculating, unyielding, and the first spark of something deeper, something irrevocably human, flickered between them, fragile but undeniable. The call connected, Damon's voice rising through the speaker, venom masked as sweetness. "Ilara, come home." She froze, heart pounding as Hale's hand brushed against hers, steady, unyielding, a silent warning, and she knew instantly that the confrontation she feared was only just beginning. The phone still vibrated faintly in Ilara's trembling hands, the screen illuminating her face with Damon's name. A cruel reminder of the life she had been forced to leave behind. The moment the call connected, his voice came through, smooth, velvety, laced with insidious charm and the faintest whisper of urgency, as if he had rehearsed every syllable to sound concerned and genuine. "Ilara, come home," he said, his tone soft, coaxing, as though it were possible to erase years of betrayal with a single well-placed phrase. But the instant those words reached her ears, a flash of fear surged through her chest, primal and sharp, the memory of his betrayal and the sting of his cruelty still raw. Hale, standing slightly behind her, observed with an intensity that made the air between them taut. His body remained rigid, controlled, yet every fiber of his being tuned to her response, every micro-expression passing across her face catalogued and interpreted. He noticed immediately that she did not hesitate, did not linger in doubt, did not even flinch toward longing. She was frightened, yes, but she was not tempted. Her eyes darted nervously, lips pressed tightly together, but there was no longing there, only instinctive, survival-driven caution. That knowledge settled in Hale's mind with a quiet certainty. Damon's words were not reaching her heart. They were attempting to manipulate her mind, to exploit her vulnerability, and she would not allow it, especially not here, not under his watch. Damon's voice, at first coated in sugar, gradually shifted into insistence, the sweetness giving way to pressure, the pressure sliding into thinly veiled anger. "Ilara, you don't understand. I'm only trying to fix things. I know I've made mistakes, but we can work this out. You belong with me. We belong together. Don't throw this away." His words were carefully crafted, like a predator testing the waters, measuring her response, gauging her fear. But Hale's eyes narrowed as he listened, each word a lie, each pause a deliberate attempt to manipulate. He already knew the truth, had dissected it with clinical precision over the past days. Damon was drowning, financially, legally, morally. He was entangled in debts, fraudulent dealings, and schemes that would collapse around him if exposed. He had not called out of love or regret, he had called out of desperation, calculating that Ilara's presence, her resources, her legal protections were the last lifeline he could exploit. Hale stepped forward, his movement deliberate, silent, commanding without a single unnecessary gesture. His hand closed around the phone, lifting it from Ilara with a fluid motion that was both protective and possessive. Damon's voice cut off mid-sentence, confusion and irritation creeping into his tone, and Hale's voice, deep and steady, resonated through the receiver like steel. "She's safe, and she's not returning." There was no room for argument, no possibility for negotiation. Every word carried authority, finality, and an unspoken promise of retribution should Damon attempt to overstep. The shift in Damon's demeanor was immediate. The honeyed tone evaporated, replaced by venom and disbelief. "What do you mean she's not returning? Where are you? You think you can—" His threats began to pile, a chaotic mixture of rage, entitlement, and panic, unraveling the careful facade he had maintained for so long. But Hale did not flinch. His jaw tightened, his grip on the phone firm, eyes cold and unyielding. "I know what you've done," he stated calmly, deliberately, each word a hammer striking a fault line. "I know about the debts, the manipulations, the lies. You do not touch her again. You will not coerce her, intimidate her, or endanger her in any way. If you do, there will be consequences you cannot survive." He ended the call with a decisive click, leaving only the faint echo of Damon's exasperated, impotent fury on the line. Ilara, still clutching the phone, trembled slightly. Not from fear, not from helplessness, but from the release of tension, from the realization that she had finally been witnessed, protected, and that she did not need to navigate this storm alone. The adrenaline that had coursed through her veins since the call began to ebb, leaving her shaken but strangely resolute. She lifted her eyes to Hale, meeting his gaze, the raw truth reflected in the depth of his dark eyes. And for the first time in what felt like years, she spoke with a quiet steadiness that carried more weight than any tears or pleading could. "Hale, what does he really want from me?" Her question hung in the air, loaded with tension, the first flicker of defiance and clarity emerging from the shadows of fear. It was not just a question, it was a declaration. She was stepping out from the prison of terror Damon had constructed around her, asserting her right to discern the truth, to confront reality without flinching. Hale's gaze softened fractionally, a silent acknowledgement that she was beginning to reclaim herself, that the small flicker of independence she had tried to cultivate was now taking shape under his protection. Meanwhile, the world outside the penthouse had already shifted. Damon, frustrated and enraged, had turned to his co-conspirator Sienna, sending terse, panicked messages with the kind of urgency only desperation breeds. "Find out who took her. I'm not losing what she can give me," the text read, stark and raw in its intent. It was a plan in motion, a threat in the making. A reminder that while Ilara had begun reclaiming her agency, the forces working against her were relentless, calculating and hungry for leverage. Hale's mind catalogued each possibility, each potential threat, each subtle vulnerability in their adversary's strategy. He did not speak yet, but the tension in his posture, the tightening of his jaw, the alertness in his eyes, all conveyed an unspoken readiness. Damon would not find her easy prey, and Hale Mercer would ensure it. Ilara, despite the residual tremors of fear, noticed the subtle shift in Hale's presence. There was no longer just observation, no longer just control. There was a promise beneath it, a silent, powerful assurance that she was seen, valued, protected. And in that moment, amid the residual echoes of Damon's threats and the hum of city life far below the penthouse, a quiet resolve settled within her. She was no longer the woman who had been abandoned in the rain, no longer the silent victim of another's schemes. She had agency, and for the first time in months, she understood that survival could coexist with hope. Hale set the phone down, eyes locking with hers, voice low but laced with steel. This isn't over. He'll try again, and when he does, we'll be ready. Ilara felt the weight of his words settle in her chest, realizing that the storm Damon represented was far from past, and that the next confrontation would demand courage she had never known she possessed. 7. The penthouse had been humming with a faint background of city noise, the usual white noise of distant traffic and the occasional siren far below, when suddenly, without warning, the lights flickered and then extinguished entirely. Darkness swallowed the room in a thick, suffocating wave, and for a heartbeat Ilara froze, rooted to the spot. Her pulse spiked, and the memories she had tried so desperately to bury, Damon locking her in dark rooms, isolating her, exploiting her fear, returned in vivid clarity. The shadows stretched long across the walls, contorted by the faint moonlight filtering through the panoramic windows, and for a moment her body shook uncontrollably, unable to distinguish the present from the torment of the past. Hale's presence was immediate. 1 step, 2 steps. He was at her side in seconds, as if he had anticipated the darkness before it even arrived. His hands gripped her arms with a calm, firm control, steadying her trembling form. "Ilara," he murmured, his voice low and commanding, yet threaded with warmth. "I've got you. Breathe with me." He positioned himself behind her, anchoring her to the floor with the certainty of someone who had faced danger countless times and emerged unshaken. His breaths were slow and deliberate, and he guided hers to match, a rhythm that gradually drew her out of the panic spiral, threatening to overtake her. Instinctively, she clutched his shirt, her fingers digging into the soft fabric as though it were the only lifeline keeping her from collapsing into memories she had spent years suppressing. Hale did not recoil. He did not flinch at the weight of her desperation. Instead, he shifted slightly, adjusting his hold to provide stability without overwhelming her, creating a shield in the darkness that blurred the boundaries between protection and possession. The warmth of his body, the controlled pressure of his hands, the sheer presence of him made the shadows seem less threatening, transforming the darkness from an enemy into a sanctuary. Fragile, but undeniable. "Nothing will touch you," he murmured, voice vibrating through the tense silence, each word deliberate and unyielding. "Not tonight, not ever. No one will ever hurt you again." The conviction in his tone resonated with her, seeped into her chest, and a shiver of relief ran down her spine. Ilara's hands, still clinging to him, trembled less now, and she whispered, almost breathless, You make me feel safe." The words were small, vulnerable, yet they struck Hale with an intensity he had not anticipated. They were not a plea, not a demand. They were a confession, a surrender, a bridge from fear to trust, and it rattled him in ways he had carefully avoided allowing himself to feel. For a moment, the world contracted to the space between them, the electricity in the air thick enough to taste. His hand lifted tentatively, brushing a strand of hair from her damp forehead, fingers lingering longer than strictly necessary. He fought the urge to close the small gap between them, to let the tension that had been coiling silently for days finally erupt. There was an almost unbearable heat in his chest, an unspoken dangerous pull that he recognized but resisted. Every instinct screamed to bridge the distance, to feel the warmth of her lips, to inhale the scent of her presence fully. But he maintained restraint, because protection did not include indulgence in desire when danger lurked too close. The stillness, heavy and intimate, shattered abruptly. Hale's phone buzzed sharply, the vibration against the hard surface echoing in the darkened penthouse. His eyes snapped to it, calculating, instinctual. The screen displayed the alert from security. Damon was downstairs in the lobby, demanding immediate access. Hale's jaw tightened, the controlled heat in his chest freezing into icy focus. The predator he had glimpsed in Damon's calls now materialized in the real world, and the controlled calm he had cultivated over weeks crystallized into immediate, actionable strategy. Ilara, still clinging to him, felt the shift instantly. The warmth that had cocooned her moments ago now mingled with a sudden, palpable tension, a reminder that the darkness around them was no longer just metaphorical. It represented real, immediate danger. Hale's hands did not leave her. Instead, he subtly shifted his weight, positioning himself between her and the unseen threat below, a shield manifest in human form. He whispered, voice low and deliberate, "Stay behind me, don't move." His words, though brief, carried layers of command, reassurance, and urgency, and Ilara obeyed instinctively, her body pressed close to his, anchored in trust. The darkness seemed to thicken around them, stretching the moment taut, elongating the seconds into an eternity. Every sound, the distant hum of elevators, the faint clatter of a metal door in the building, the rush of wind against the windows, registered as potential threats. Hale's eyes flicked briefly to the balcony, to the security panel, to the faint outline of movement below. He catalogued everything silently, efficiently, leaving no room for error. Yet even in the tension, he remained attuned to Ilara, feeling the tiny, subtle tremors of her fear through the contact of their bodies, aware of every heartbeat that raced in response to the threat. And then, almost imperceptibly, her grip on him tightened. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his chest in a gesture that was not just fear, but need, a human acknowledgement that she was no longer willing to face danger alone. Hale's hand moved instinctively, cupping her cheek gently, a touch both tender and possessive. He resisted the magnetism that drew him closer, resisted the temptation to let the growing heat between them dictate his actions, because right now, priority one was safety, not passion. Yet the air between them crackled, dense with tension, a current of desire that neither could fully ignore. For a few moments, the world existed only in small breaths, in warmth pressed against cold air, in the unspoken words that passed silently between them. And then, the buzz of his phone broke the fragile intimacy, pulling Hale's attention entirely toward the immediate threat. He stepped back, releasing the gentle hold on her face, his mind snapping into tactical focus. Security confirmed the unwelcome intruder below. Damon, unyielding, demanding, blind to consequences, ready to storm the sanctuary Hale had built around her. Every muscle in Hale's body coiled, precise and ready for action, and he became the protector, the sentinel, the unmovable barrier between Ilara and the chaos approaching from the lobby. Ilara watched him, understanding now in a visceral way the man she had begun to rely on. He was not merely a savior in moments of danger, he was a force of nature, calculated, decisive, unyielding. And despite the storm of fear and threat around them, a tiny seed of something else took root in her chest. A flicker of trust, a sliver of hope, and the first undeniable spark that she was no longer alone in the world. Hale's voice, low and commanding, barely above a whisper but charged with authority, cut through the darkness. "Damon is here. You stay behind me, and you don't look down." Ilara's heart lurched as the first sounds of chaos, shouts, the echo of footsteps, the metallic click of the lobby door, rose from below. The night had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. Hale descended the staircase with deliberate calm, each step measured, controlled, exuding a quiet authority that seemed to bend the very air of the penthouse lobby around him. The lights flickered briefly, a reminder of the recent power outage, and the shadows cast by the towering windows made the space look both vast and vulnerable. He spotted Damon instantly, standing at the reception with an expression oscillating between fury and disbelief, his posture rigid, his hands clenching, as if he could physically will Ilara back to him. Hale's eyes did not waver, did not betray emotion, but internally, each microsecond was analyzed, calculated. He catalogued Damon's energy, the tension radiating from him, the flicker of desperation in his eyes. He could smell it, almost taste the panic hidden beneath Damon's practiced veneer. Damon's voice cut through the quiet lobby like a blade, sharp and confident at first. "You think you can just take her? You think she belongs to you?" His words were venomous, loaded with the entitlement of a man accustomed to control, but Hale remained silent, allowing the fury to build in Damon before striking. He let Damon continue to spill his rehearsed lines of rage and ownership, exposing himself to scrutiny. Every syllable was catalogued, the emphasis, the hesitation, the false bravado. Hale's gaze never left him, cold, calculating, sharp as a scalpel. Then, with a fluid movement that was both subtle and devastating, Hale opened the folder he had carried. The heavy leather-bound folder fell onto the security desk with a resonant thud, the sound echoing off the marble floors and drawing every eye in the lobby. Damon's head snapped toward it, and Hale allowed a slow, deliberate pause before sliding it forward so that the contents spilled slightly, exposing their substance. Inside were stacks of evidence, meticulously compiled over hours, maybe days, before this confrontation. There were bank statements highlighting fraudulent withdrawals, offshore accounts hidden in shell companies, forged contracts, and a trail of messages between Damon and Sienna orchestrating the manipulation of Ilara. Each page, each line, each document was a calculated blow to Damon's facade, a revelation of his greed and duplicity. Damon's lips moved, forming threats and bluffs that he likely thought would intimidate Hale. "You think this paperwork means anything? I can destroy you." But Hale did not flinch. He did not respond with words. Instead, he extended a hand to the security officer standing nearby and presented a pre-signed legal order explicitly stating that Damon was trespassing. It was an immovable barrier, a prepared trap that left no room for argument or negotiation. The precision of it, the foresight, the cold, methodical control made Damon's anger falter for the first time in years. He realized that every move he had made, every calculated intimidation, had been anticipated. Hale had been several steps ahead before Damon even arrived. The air was taut, electrified with confrontation. Damon tried to regain composure, attempted one last bluff, gesturing at the folder, spitting threats and challenges. "You'll regret this. You can't protect her forever." Hale's response was simple, unyielding, and delivered with a calm that made the words strike like iron. "She's not yours to take. You are done here. Leave." Damon's body trembled with fury and frustration, his carefully maintained mask cracking, and the security team moved in, escorting him out of the building. Each step Damon took away from the penthouse felt like a fracture of his dominance, a collapse of the control he had wielded over Ilara for so long. Hale, however, did not linger to gloat. There was no satisfaction in witnessing Damon's defeat. There was only the pressing awareness of Ilara's presence, the fragile and delicate nature of the woman whose safety he had guaranteed. He ascended the staircase back to the penthouse with steady purpose, aware that her eyes would follow every movement, that her breath might hitch with uncertainty, that she might fear he would now, after the storm passed, retreat into the cold fortress of his personality. Ilara stood, frozen, hands clasped tightly in front of her, chest heaving slightly, the remnants of fear mingling with relief. She looked up as Hale entered the room, and for a moment, the vastness of the penthouse seemed to shrink around the magnetic pull between them. Hale's gaze softened only marginally, but enough for her to notice the faint shift from calculated guardian to something more attentive, more present, more human. Without hesitation, he closed the distance between them, careful not to startle, careful to convey both control and gentleness. His hand reached out, cupping her jaw with a surprising tenderness that contrasted with the ruthless precision he had just displayed downstairs. The pressure of his palm was deliberate, grounding, anchoring her to him, sending a silent message that she was no longer vulnerable, that she could breathe again. He leaned slightly closer, the faint scent of his cologne mixing with the warm air, creating an intimacy that was electric, yet restrained. "You're staying here," Hale said, voice low, deliberate, unwavering. Each word was infused with intent, a promise that was neither romantic fluff nor superficial comfort. It was an assertion of reality, a statement of fact that he would not abandon her, not now, not ever. "I don't want you anywhere else." The admission hit harder than any confession of love because it was not colored with infatuation or desire. It was real, measured, and entirely grounded in his awareness of her worth, her vulnerability, and her resilience. Hale's eyes searched hers, seeking recognition, acceptance, and perhaps a subtle acknowledgement of the bond that had developed in mere days but carried the weight of months of danger, protection, and mutual understanding. Ilara's breath hitched, and for the first time she felt seen, not as property, not as a pawn, but as a human being who mattered. The warmth of his gaze, the firm weight of his hand, and the unspoken promise embedded in his words coiled together into a quiet revelation. She had a protector, a guardian, and perhaps something more, though neither dared name it aloud yet. Hale's thumb brushed along her cheekbone, gentle, almost hesitant, betraying the slightest crack in his armor of restraint. "I don't know how to let you go," he whispered, the words falling into the charged silence between them, like a confession and a threat combined. It was the kind of statement that could ignite hope, fear, and desire all at once. Ilara's eyes met his, searching, questioning, but finding only truth and restraint, and the weight of it pressed into her chest, filling the space with tension that was both frightening and intoxicating. Just as the quiet seemed to settle, Hale's phone buzzed again, a subtle vibration against the sleek surface of the desk. He glanced at it, frowning, and the single word flashing on the screen made Ilara's stomach drop. "Sienna. Urgent. Ilara." The message was brief, threatening, and ambiguous, a stark reminder that while Damon had been removed, the storm surrounding her life was far from over, and the next confrontation would demand courage, strategy, and perhaps sacrifices neither of them were ready to face. The first tendrils of sunlight crept over the horizon, painting the city in soft gold and rose hues, reflecting off the glass towers that seemed to stretch endlessly into the morning sky. Hale led Ilara silently through the penthouse, past the familiar corridors that had, over the past days, transformed from intimidating spaces into something that felt like cautious sanctuary. He didn't speak until they reached the rooftop terrace, a space open to the vast skyline, the wind carrying a gentle chill that teased at the edges of her hair. The city spread beneath them like a living organism, awake and radiant, and for a moment the only sound was the faint whisper of wind brushing past. Ilara paused at the edge, her fingers gripping the railing, her chest rising with cautious breaths. The events of the past nights pressed against her mind, the fear, the darkness, the unexpected safety, and the raw, magnetic pull she felt toward Hale. She turned slightly, meeting his gaze, and in that quiet, golden moment, the vulnerability in her eyes was palpable. But so was something else, a nascent strength, a will to choose for herself rather than be moved by circumstance. Hale watched her, his sharp, calculating gaze softened by the warmth that had begun to take root in his chest. the one he had tried to deny but could no longer ignore. "Ilara," he began, voice low, steady, the same controlled tone he used in boardrooms and board meetings, a tone that carried absolute honesty. "I don't know when it began. The moment I saw you, I thought I was only helping someone in need, protecting her. But now, I see that you've changed something in me." His words were measured, yet every syllable was charged with unspoken emotion. The weight of nights spent close to her, observing her resilience, her grace under relentless pressure, and the subtle intimacy that had grown between them. "I don't know when it started, but I know I don't want it to stop." Ilara's heart thrummed violently in her chest. She took a slow step forward, closing a fraction of the space that had existed between them, not because of fear, not because she needed protection, but because she wanted to. Her voice, quiet yet firm, cut through the morning air. "I don't want to be rescued," she said. "I never did. I want to choose. I want to make a decision for myself." Each word resonated with independence and courage, the echoes of her past fears fading against the clarity of her intention. Hale's eyes softened further, and for the first time the stoicism of his face gave way to a faint smile, restrained but undeniable. He extended his hand toward her, not as a demand, not as a claim, but as an invitation. The tension in the air shifted subtly, filled with anticipation and trust. Ilara hesitated only briefly before taking it, her fingers sliding into his, intertwining naturally. She whispered, almost reverently, "I choose this." The simplicity of the words carried a profound weight. Hale exhaled, a long, steady release, a sound that conveyed relief, hope, and the acknowledgement of something new, something genuine. He drew her closer, letting the connection linger, enveloping them both in warmth and quiet relief. When he finally embraced her fully, it was not a dramatic declaration or a desperate grab. It was a grounding, tender, and intimate acknowledgement of what had passed and what was beginning. The penthouse, the city below, and the distant chaos faded into insignificance as they held onto each other, the first rays of sunlight casting them in a soft, golden glow, the start of a new chapter written not in fear or desperation, but in choice, trust, and emerging love. For Ilara, the sensation of being chosen, being protected, and being seen simultaneously was unlike anything she had experienced. She rested her head against Hale's chest, inhaling the faint scent that had become both comfort and temptation, realizing that safety did not negate desire. It amplified it. Her fingers pressed lightly against his side, feeling the subtle tension in his muscles, the controlled restraint that spoke volumes about his personality, a man who measured every action, every emotion, but whose heart had begun to respond in ways he could no longer contain entirely. Hale tilted his chin, brushing a light kiss along her temple, a gesture that was both possessive and gentle, encapsulating the complexity of his emotions. "You've changed the way I see everything," he admitted quietly, the words almost lost to the wind, but resonating with profound truth. "You've reminded me that there's more to life than control, more than deals, more than power, and I need to keep you in this life, not because of duty, not because of fear, but because of what you are." Ilara lifted her gaze, her eyes meeting his. She saw the honesty reflected there, the careful restraint, the undeniable pull that had built between them. The fear that had once dominated her being was now replaced with clarity and courage. "I trust you," she said softly. "Not because I have to, not because I can't choose anything else. I trust you because I want to." The words were small but deliberate, a declaration that resonated with authority over her own life, and the tension in Hale's chest eased slightly, though not completely. There was still restraint, but now tempered with profound satisfaction. They lingered in that moment, the city stretching beneath them like a living canvas filled with potential, danger, and opportunity. The air was filled with unspoken questions. What would come next? Could they truly trust the world outside? But for now, they existed in a bubble of mutual understanding, mutual choice, and mutual acknowledgement of what they had endured and survived together. And then, the sudden vibration of Hale's phone cut through the morning, calm, sharp, and insistent. He glanced at the screen, frowning, the subtle tension returning as he read the message from his assistant. "Sir, Sienna is requesting an urgent meeting. She says it's about Ilara and Damon." The words were brief, clinical, yet charged with implicit threat and urgency. The reminder that the world beyond this rooftop was not yet resolved intruded on their fragile peace, promising that while a beginning had been made, the shadows of the past were still very much alive. Ilara felt her fingers tighten on his hand, a silent question, a tacit acknowledgement that whatever awaited them, they would face it together. Hale's gaze swept over her, a mixture of determination, protectiveness, and quiet resolve. The tension of the unknown did not diminish the significance of the present. Instead, it underscored it. He stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face, anchoring her gaze with his own. "We'll face it," he said simply, voice steady, every syllable weighted with certainty. "Whatever comes, together. You're not going anywhere, ever again." The words were not a promise of perfection, not a fairy tale declaration, but a foundation of real, deliberate intention, the kind that could withstand storms, deceit, and chaos. Ilara nodded, her own heart swelling with the same conviction, the sense of finally choosing her life, her path, her protector, and perhaps even the beginnings of love that was as real as it was tentative. They stood together as the sun climbed higher, bathing the city and them in warmth. The morning air carried with it both the weight of unresolved threats and the lightness of a new start. For the first time in years, Ilara felt truly free, not from danger, not from the past, but free to choose, free to trust, and free to step forward into a life that was entirely her own, hand in hand with a man who had become her anchor, her shield, and slowly, something far deeper. Hale's thumb brushed over her knuckles as he looked at the horizon, his voice low but edged with steel. "Sienna thinks she can come between us, but she doesn't know who she's dealing with." Ilara's breath caught at the implication, and even in the quiet morning, a pulse of tension promised that their story was just beginning, not in fear, but in strength, choice, and defiance of the chaos that had once ruled their lives. And that's the end of today's story. Ilara's journey reminds us that even in the darkest moments, strength, choice, and love can change everything. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Beyond Color Stories so you never miss another unforgettable tale. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, remember, every ending can be the beginning of something beautiful.